Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 602. I'm Tom Cagley, your host, and in this SPaMCAST 602, we feature my interview with Duncan DeVore, the co-author of Reactive Application Development. Duncan and I talked about reactive design patterns, adopting a reactive architecture, and how writing a book changes your outlook on life. It was a really cool discussion that covered technical and non-technical topics. I think you'll like it. By the way, I am deeply sorry that I missed last week. I really didn't expect my brand new laptop, less than a month old, to have its motherboard and SSD fail. I'm thankful for backups. Duncan's bio. Duncan specializes in the design and implementation of distributed systems using the tenets of the Reactive Manifesto with Scala, Akka, and the Typesafe stack. He believes in responsible design through functional programming with an abundance of test coverage. He loves to code, present, and help others work through challenges of distributed computing. Are you ready to talk reactive development? It's time for the interview. Duncan DeVore, co-author of Reactive Application Development. Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Duncan, let's just dive right in. You, as an author of a book, obviously have done a ton of research. You've gotten really into the weeds in terms of reactive application development. Why don't we start and help my listeners with a little bit of preamble by talking about what do you mean by reactive application development, reactive design patterns? What are they?
Sure. There's reactive is an interesting word. Especially since it's taken on multiple meanings, I think, over the last 8 years or so. What I'm referring to in the book and in relationship to design patterns is almost more of a philosophy or a way to think about how you want to deal with, the future of your application development. So the idea is historically, and this is changing, because a lot of companies have began the process of embracing a reactive mindset. But historically, it was, let's try to build the most robust system that we can possibly build, as so that if there's a lot of fail-safe mechanisms built into it, that the system we're designing it such that it doesn't fail, is the idea. And I think from the origin, that made sense, as we did not have the type of requirements that we're facing today, like with the Internet of Things, and the amount of data that is flowing in today's world is it's so massive. It wasn't even considered possible, I would say, even as early as 10 years ago. So that really forced, I think, the community to start thinking about how we design applications, how these applications are going to behave under load or under stress in the sense of errors, and how we want to manage that. So I think initially a lot of folks would stand up essentially replications of the service. So you have a machine that has a particular service deployed to it, or it could have multiple services, and then you basically replicate that. So if that machine craters, then the load will just, based on a router, will travel to the next machine in order. And the challenge behind that was, that's essentially causing the problem. If you think of it this way, if you say, hey, I have a problem, my sink is overflowing, well, I'm just going to get a second sink, right? So you put a second sink beside it and you say, hey, oh no, now the second sink is flowing. I mean, how many sinks are you going to get, right? Is the idea. So we kind of went back to the, ground zero, so to speak, and said, hey, how can we handle this differently? And I like the biology example, right? The human body adapts and changes as it receives new influence, right? And it kind of self-heals is the idea. And so the idea behind reactive, as in the macro, is let's build systems that are able to essentially assess their situation and make decisions to take particular courses of action in light of failure or in light of load. So rather than rejecting failure and trying to build a system that doesn't fail, which is for the most part impossible, the notion behind reactive, at least from our perspective, is embracing failure. Akka is a tool that we use quite a bit, and its moniker used to be "Let It Crash." And so the idea is that your system should be able to expect and embrace failure. And when a failure occurs, it should be able to recover from that failure on its own without human intervention. So that's a big piece of the reactive puzzle. And then also with load, the load should be able to sense that load is increasing and then therefore scale. So the idea is you can scale up by using more compute resources, or you can scale out by using more machines. And there's a website called the Reactive Manifesto, which kind of captures the ideals behind this. And I think it's at 40-some thousand signatures now. And it kind of captures that idea. And I bring this up because it's different than reactive programming. What we're talking about, I would say reactive programming is a part of this overall philosophy.
Is this philosophy localized to specific industries, or are you seeing this leveraged across the board?
That's a great question. So I'm seeing this being used across the board. And I think if for startups especially, you see a lot of folks approaching this as a new way to do things. But I'm also seeing quite a bit of Fortune 500 companies beginning to embrace it. I've been around for a while, and COBOL and mainframes were kind of the mainstay of the financial industry and other industries. And even today, there's still quite a few applications running in that environment. But ultimately, when companies like Google and Amazon and Netflix and companies like this came into existence, the volume at which they were moving data far exceeded anything anybody had ever dreamed of. And so they had to invent new ways to do things, right? They relied on the fundamentals of distributed computing, and they had to live in that environment. And out of that effort grew the notion of this Reactive Manifesto started by Jonas Bonaire back in, I think it was 2012, roughly. I'd have to go back and look at the date. I don't remember it off the top of my head. And basically what it was saying is that, hey, rather than using this typical failover design, we're going to embrace distributed computing. Now, that opens up a door to a whole lot of other issues that you don't see in your typical monolithic design. And those issues can be complicated and scary. And so a lot of people, a lot of companies took their time beginning to embrace those ideas. But yes, as of today, I see quite a few Fortune 500 companies implementing it. A lot of banks, right, have been implementing the reactive style, and even medical facilities and emergency response systems. A lot of them are walking down that path now because the volume has simply outgrown their current architectures.
So if an organization was going to embrace this, is this something that teams can just pick up, or does this require sort of an architectural view and an architectural mandate that pushes people down that road?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish I could say you could just spin it up like any old framework and turn it on and you're off to the races. There is a certain level of knowledge and understanding that a group needs to attain in order to be effective in this. Ultimately, like I said, we're talking about distributed computing here, but so I think there's the pros of it are it requires the engineer to understand some of the fundamental principles of distributed computing. And as a result, I think you end up getting better quality engineers, and your teams can be a little bit smaller than maybe your traditional team, but your reaction time also is generally much faster, especially in the area around things like continuous deployment or continuous integration and continuous deployment. When you're dealing with a large, complex problem, we all learned in school, break it down into little chunks, right? And get those little chunks working and then start to assemble it. It's no different in this scenario either. And so you can look at it holistically, right? From the 30,000 foot view of how you want to do it, but for the weeds, you have to focus on small chunks at a time and slowly assemble those small chunks. And this style to be kind of lends itself to that Lego style building of things. So yeah, I think you're going to see it more and more. In fact, I got to be honest with you. I am quite impressed by several of the Fortune 500 companies that have begun to do this, because they're a giant beast, so to speak. And there's a lot on to change the way folks think. Historically, they would generally think of themselves, or they would think of IT or a software engineering. Now they're having to reevaluate that and redefine themselves. So companies like Capital One and Netflix and a lot of these other companies beginning to look at themselves for like a software company than a bank or a streaming service. In fact, I heard someone, I was posting Slack the other day, and I can't remember the details, but there was a failure in the industry of several companies, and the person had commented, your company is only as good as your technology. I think that's becoming more and more apparent as time goes on.
And your cash flow. Both of those. If you were to boil down the book into a central theme or a central message, what would it be?
Hey, there's a new way to think about how to solve these problems. It's quite effective. It contains a set of examples which press into the key topics in the reactive philosophy and gives you some real-world examples of how to solve those problems. So I look at the book as kind of like a reference manual. So, for example, if you're doing drywall or framing, there's all kinds of great books you can buy at Home Depot or whatever that can help you do that. And you kind of use it as a reference as you begin a particular part. You find that in the book and use it. I think that's the way I would look at our book, as a good reference for helping you, get your feet wet. And I would say I'd say our book is really oriented towards new to maybe a mid-level engineer. If you have years and years of experience in distributed computing, then you may learn some things from the book, but you'll probably know most of what's in the book already.
What got you here? This is a very specific book, a very specific topic. Why start your authorship career here?
That's a great question. So first of all, I never thought of myself as an author or even had the ability to write a book. So that was a great experience for me personally. But what really started it was I had an opportunity about 10 years ago to join a company. And, in that company, we were basically gathering quite a bit of data and building applications the traditional way. And I realized 6 months to a year now, we're not going to be able to handle this volume. And I don't know what we're going to do, right? And so I began to do a lot of research and learn a lot of things about this type of structure and software design. And I thought, wow, this really looks like it could work. This really looks like it is designed to handle these types of problems. So I went through that process of building out that architecture. I had a team of about 20 people, and we went through that process, and it worked really, really good. And the thing that blew me away is that it was the first application that I had been a part of creating that was pushed into production and had ran for over 2 years straight with never crashing a single time. And that just was really an impact on my view of system design and that type of stuff. And I felt that, hey, this is a good opportunity to share some of these ideas with others, and pull together a way to lay out our experiences and our views on things and so forth. And in addition, also, I mean, to be honest, it helped grow my career as well. So it's kind of like a two-win situation. One, I think the book helps folks that are looking to get into this if it's a new area or they've only been there a little bit, and then also help myself take the next step in my career.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Did the book just sort of leap out, or did you have to learn new things as you went through it? And what was the most surprising thing that you had to learn to actually get a book to market?
Working with other people. No, I'm just teasing. But yeah, it's always a challenge. I initially had the view, I'm a big believer in learning through analogy or analogical reasoning. And my view for the book at the time was to tell a story from start to finish. And one of the things that I learned was, while that's a great idea and that's one way to approach it, that another way to approach it is just give a group of different types of examples where people may be more familiar with than perhaps some story that you're trying to use as an analogy. That was a struggle for me because I really didn't agree with that philosophy, but over time I began to see the value of it. And so that was an approach, I guess, in learning that as going through that process, I realized was a valid way to move forward. So I thought that was interesting. I'm still a big fan of analogical reasoning and that style of teaching, but I do believe now that you can pull in another type of example from a completely different industry, and you can still have that flow. So I think that process of learning that, learning to use something like Grammarly to capture errors and things like that, using the appropriate tools, and writing the code and posting it out to like GitHub and so forth. That whole process, I think, was very fulfilling. And it was also something that kind of pushed me because I still had a full-time job that I had to work on. Mm-hmm. So, and a family and all that stuff. So balancing all that was an interesting endeavor, to say the least.
Absolutely. So you said that this is something that has, changed your career trajectory. How has writing a book actually changed your career trajectory?
I think number one, whenever you take on things like writing a book, anybody who has ever written a book, and even people that haven't, they can kind of appreciate the amount of work that goes into it. And when you take a look at somebody who is, working and then also is writing a book or something like that, you can kind of get a sense, assuming that the material in the book is good, right? Mm-hmm. You can kind of get a sense that this person does a pretty good job at managing their time to a certain degree. They can do, or they can invest time, or at least organize themselves in such a manner that they're able to achieve goals in parallel, even though they're not working on. I'm not a big fan of multitasking, so it's kind of like context switching, where you're working during the day, you stop, and then you switch to book mode, and then you work on that, and so forth. And as a result, you also have to push code samples out to things like GitHub, etc. And people now, you're kind of like putting yourself out there. People can look at they can look at your code, they can look at the book, they can see how you think and stuff like that. So it kind of gives them a preview of you before they've ever even seen or talked to you. And I think it's to some degree a bold step to do in your career, because it could go south, right? If what you're saying is not good stuff. And I think that as a result, people now, they begin to look at you as someone who knows what they're talking about, et cetera, and those kinds of things. And it kind of breaks the ice, so to speak, to talk to other folks about something that they're interested in, that you have a lot of experience in. So as a result, that allowed me to maybe interview with companies that I would have been harder to get an interview with because I've, kind of picked a hill to stand on and established myself there. I think any programmer or engineer who is very interested in the technologies that they're dealing with, I think writing a book is a great way to grow yourself in a lot of different ways. So I highly recommend it. It's like having a child almost. Maybe not quite as difficult, but close.
I understand. And that was a good way to wrap it back. Before we jump sort of into the final wrapping this up, all of that, writing the book part of it, does it affect and the reviews and putting things out, has that affected how you approach project work or product work?
I would say it has confirmed how I approach project work. And what I mean by that is, I think, how they say the destination is the journey? I would say the same thing about this. The destination of some project that you're trying to push out, or the result, is actually the process of doing that. When it's complete, right? What did you learn? You learned everything as you walked that line. And part of walking that line, one of the most important pieces, is perseverance, right? Because it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how much experience you have, you're still going to run into challenges. And you can't let those challenges overcome you. Now, some folks, it's just not an issue, right? The challenges are not that they're easy to overcome, but mentally they're not as big of a barrier or emotionally as they are for others. And for myself, the learning experience is, I actually can do this, right, on a larger scale than when you're younger and you're part of a team, you're one of the pieces in the cog. But as you get older and say you gain more responsibility, it's quite a task to take responsibility for pushing out a software effort that's going to affect the company's bottom line, like 5, 10, 15, 20%. And if you step back and think about that too much, you can start to say, wow, this is kind of scary, because if I mess this up, this could really affect, a whole bunch of people. And I think the book, walking down that path, confirmed for myself that, yeah, you can do this stuff. Like, are you perfect? No, not by any means. But getting the right people on a team and kind of, working forward to achieve that goal. Don't worry about whether you're going to achieve it or not, right? That's just wasted time. Just walk towards it and you will get there, unless there's some catastrophic, failure, like the company goes bankrupt or whatever. But, the key to meeting that goal is just walking towards it and acquiring the knowledge that you need during that journey to get there. Just don't give up, right? Believe in yourself. Just keep pushing. You're going to wake up days where you're going to say, hey, I can't do this. I can't do it. I can't do it because I'm not smart enough, or I can't do it because I don't have enough time, or whatever. You just got to take those thoughts and push them aside and keep moving forward. And you will get there.
Duncan, if you woke up tomorrow morning and were granted 2 wishes, somebody handed you a magic wand, a cup of coffee, and said you could change any 2 things that impact the delivery of value from applications, what would those 2 things be and why?
It's funny, in reading through the questions, that one really stuck out in my mind. And I thought about that quite a bit. And I would say the one answer, I think the one will be surprising. If I could change things or do something that would drive me to that location sooner, one of them would be education. I believe the states, or the U.S. to a certain degree, especially in high schools and lower, the educational process has decreased in the last 40 years, and I think it's a sad thing to see. So many of my colleagues, what was required of them in high school was, especially in Europe and other places, was far greater than what we had to do. And looking back on that, I had to end up paying that price in college and learning a bunch of things that probably should have learned in high school, I guess. And my high school was actually very good. It had one of the highest ratings in the States. But I was talking to a fellow engineer, and he told me when he was in high school, they actually had to write their own linked lists. They couldn't even use the library. And I was like, are you serious? He's like, yep, we had to do all that. And it was very hard and very challenging, but it set me up to be in a much better place. So I would say education would be one of the things. And then the second thing, just time management, being more aware of my time management, because when you do have a full-time job and a family and you're taking on something like a book, there are prices to pay, right? So I didn't get as much time to spend with my children. I don't know that there's any other way that I could have done it, but if I could go back and revisit that, and I think that the way that I would have done it differently is I would have set boundaries, and I would have said, okay, I can write from 6 to 9 or something, 4 days a week, and then the other days, especially on the weekends or whatever, I would spend with the family. So I think those two things would be things that if I could change, I would.
Duncan DeVore, co-author of Reactive Application Development. This has been absolutely marvelous and very penetrating. If people wanted to continue the conversation, how would they go about doing that?
They can reach me on Twitter and at GitHub at Ironfish. My call is on GitHub is just Ironfish, IRONFISH, and my Twitter is at IRONFISH. So those two ways are real easy to get me.
All right. I'll have that contact information in the show notes. Obviously, we want people to go out and buy a copy of the book, but is there anything else that you would like to promote?
I think software engineering is a great career. There's a lot of opportunities. It's something that folks shouldn't be scared of. You don't have to be an expert in math to be a good software engineer. It doesn't hurt to be able to do math real well, but you don't have to be an expert. I think the biggest thing is there's a lot of opportunities in this industry that aren't necessarily related to programming. You should know programming and how to do it, but you could go into security. There's just a whole plethora of opportunities. And so, and regardless of your age, I don't care if you've been a shucker for 30 years and you decide that I'm going to change my career. I know several people that have done that in their 40s and in their 50s, have gone back to school and switched to, IT. So I would encourage, if that's an area you're interested in, again, just like I said earlier, that's your destination. Just start walking towards it and you will get there. Just don't give up.
I really like the philosophy. Duncan DeVore, author of Reactive Application Development. Thank you for spending time today with the Software Process and Measurement Cast listeners.
Thank you so much. It was a joy to be on.
And we're back with news from Reread Saturday. Week 2 of our journey through Tame Your Workflow by Steve Tendon and Daniel Doron finds us discussing the prologue. The prologue introduces concepts and provides a bridge for readers to this book from The Goal, Eli Goldratt, and Steve Tendon and Wolfram Mueller's book, Hyperproductive Knowledge Work Performance, the Tame Flow Approach and its Application to Scrum and Kanban. Next week, we hit chapter 1, so remember, buy a copy, support the podcast and the authors. It really does make a difference by buying a copy of the book and reading along. In the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 603, we will feature my interview with Austin Chadwick. Austin and I talked mobbing, but perhaps more importantly to me, Austin talked about the impact of finding joy in everything you do. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?